Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain virtual and Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain Bedfordshire event, and we're very, very pleased to welcome you after a long gap caused by you know what. And we're very, very grateful to our guests for joining us. So I will move straight to introductions. We're very, very happy to have Dr. Shirin Housee and Professor Uvanney Maylor with us tonight. Shirin is Senior Lecturer and Course Leader in Sociology at the University of Wolverhampton, and her research in education has focused on issues of access, progression, general equal opportunities, and more recently she's been researching and writing on anti-racist education in higher education contexts, with a particular concern for the experiences of BAME students. She has extensive experience in work on anti-racist pedagogy, and she'll be speaking to that tonight. And her work also focuses on classroom interaction, engagement, student group dialogue, and staff-student discussions. Her teaching and research inform one another, and she's widely recognized as an expert in the field of anti-racist education and critical pedagogy in higher education in the UK. Uvanney is Professor of Education at the University of Bedfordshire, where she's also a member of the Institute of Research in Education and a former director of that institute. Her research is committed to educational equity, inclusion, and social justice. And she's particularly interested in the experiences of BAME students and professionals, as well as a range of issues related to race, ethnicity, racism, and culture, and their impact on educational practices in schools, colleges, and universities. By bringing greater scrutiny to bear on educational practices, Uvanney's work aims to have a positive impact on educational experience and outcomes for minority ethnic groups, and to inform and promote anti-racist educational practice. And as I say, we are very, very grateful and very pleased that Shirin and Uvanney are joining us tonight. You may have noticed on the flyer that went out that we've billed this as a discussion rather than as twinned presentations, formal presentations. I don't think the evening will be radically different to what we're used to, but rather than reading from or summarizing their papers, recent papers that I'm sure Shirin and Uvanney will talk you through, Uvanney and Shirin are going to begin by talking to each other about their recent research, their recent published work, and discuss points of convergence, points of divergence, and so on. Both Uvanney and Shirin have said that if a question, or if any sort of question occurs to you that you would like to be addressed, there and then, they've said please feel free to turn your microphone on and jump in with your question. Now we know that if everyone tries to do that at the same time, Zoom probably won't cope, but we do want this to be, as far as possible, a discussion rather than formal presentations. So we're going to try that. And we're very pleased that Uvanney and Shirin are open to that, and we're going to try that. So if you would like to ask a question, our presenters say, our guests say, jump in as and when. And then once their conversation has reached a natural pause, we'll open things up generally again. And as far as possible, we know that this is not possible in all cases, but as far as possible, Uvanney and Shirin have encouraged people to get up on the mic rather than the chat function. That is about it from me. So once again, thank you to our guests, and over to them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for this opportunity of sharing our work. So, hi, Uvanney. I can see you. So, I mean, I think we're going to talk. Hi, we're going to be talking to our individual papers with each other, like a conversation. But like Ollie's already said, just raise questions as they occur. So, should we start with asking each other questions and making points to the similarity?
Yes, happy to do that, Shirin.
Okay. Okay. One of the things that I found really interesting, and it is really, really interesting and relevant discussion in that chapter on curriculum diversity, social justice education. 'Cause for me, social justice should be so closely linked to educational provisions. You know, ultimately we should be providing a good education, as you said, with the hope that it does good stuff for our students and our pupils so they make a better world. It sounds idealistic, but I think for me, the purpose of education is that opening out of minds, is that critical thinking of the world that we live in. So when our students leave the universities and schools, then hopefully there's a character building as well as qualifications that takes place in their education. I don't know how you feel about that, Uvanney.
I mean, I would agree with that, Shirin. But I think in order to do that, there has to be a belief in social justice and actually an understanding of what that actually means in practice. And if you're committed to social justice, it means that you want a better and more equal world. But in terms of social justice, also thinking in relation to the curriculum, and the purpose of education is that we would be seeking to have equality of outcomes.
Yeah.
There's no point talking about social justice education without thinking, on the other hand, that you also want to drive equality of outcomes, because you want to ensure that those who have not been achieving as well are able to achieve equally as your higher achievers, or those who have, for long-standing reasons, done really well. And here I'm thinking about our white middle class students effectively. So you actually want to make a difference, but in order to do that, you've got to understand where you're coming from a social justice perspective to create a better world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point about social outcomes absolutely spot on, because one of the things that come to mind, particularly my work is on higher education, is that I always feel that the statistics will show that our BAME students enter university with on par qualification, wherever they're at, with their white peer group. But sadly, once they go through their higher education experience, they end up with a lower awards in their degree classification. And that disturbs me a lot. So then I kind of think, well, what actually happens in that 3 years of their degree? What is it that we are not doing enough for them? So I think social outcomes is absolutely essential. And it is, and so now, well, as we know from the decolonization debate on my paper, and everyone's talking about it, that is it to do with their lack of engagement? Is it to do with, and you talk about this, that the staff or the curriculum, the representation of their education institution doesn't talk to their experience, so therefore they're not so engaged with their education, and therefore do not do as well as their white peer groups. And that's a pattern I'm seeing in our universities. And I know less of school education, but would you say that's the causes as to why BAME students are not doing as well?
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, but I think it's a bit more than that. So there is a lack of understanding of the different cultural contexts, the student backgrounds that they're bringing to that learning experience. And there is a question of the extent to which I think educators actually want to know more about the students that they see in front of them. So, and for me, when I look in terms of the school system, I want teachers to see the pupils in front of them as more than just an individual, but to understand, you know, their backgrounds they're coming from. So whether this applies, whether they are Black, white, you know, Asian, whatever ethnic group they come from, you know, I'd like them to know a bit more about the backgrounds that that student is bringing to that learning experience. You know, and to also understand what the qualification, also in terms of that, their qualifications that bring into the learning experience as well. So I've found in terms of school teaching that there are lots of stereotypes that are bound about these different ethnic groups. And so students are caricatured in that way right from the outset. So just thinking about the point you were making in relation to students coming in on a par, so minority students coming in on a par with white students, in terms of their achievement level, at A level, for example, but then leaving with a lower classification degree, and what happens in that process. And I think what happens as part of that process is that staff they bound up with the kind of stereotypes about those different groups. So for example, I constantly hear, well, Black students underachieve. So there's an expectation that they're going to underachieve, whether they were likely to or not. And so then there is a question about how do you challenge that stereotype, and what actually is the expectation staff have for those students to achieve. Because as we know, you can have a high achieving white student who equally underachieves, but that doesn't get noticed because of the number of white students within the education system. So I'm saying it's quite complex, but we also need to understand our own perceptions about different student groups within the student environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct. And there's two things that came to mind when you shared that comment there. And one is it's something that me and Uvanney have been probably understanding and know of for the last 30 or 40 years. Two things there. One is that when we don't understand or we don't seek to find out why BAME students are failing, then we problematize them as the problem. So they are the problem, either to do with that they don't engage or they like the subject content, rather than looking outside of the students and seeing whether the problem is actually institutional, whether it's curriculum based, whether it's teacher-student relationship. The problem is often put at the feet of the students themselves. And I, like you said, I hear that a lot. Of course, people are very careful how that's said, but often it's, they're just not engaged. They don't like to read theory. They don't. And I'm constantly saying, well, maybe we should try a different version of it. Maybe we should just try a different curriculum, or maybe we should try different writers. It's our problem. And I always say this to my colleagues and my students. If my students don't do well, the first person I look to is myself. And I actually then want to know, why is it so-and-so stopped coming to class, or after 5 lectures, so they're not actually that engaged. I always look to myself, and I think that's a good thing, to try and work out what it is we can do to make our students more engaged. And I think that's the one of the main issues here, is to not problematize our students, is to look for the problem elsewhere. The other thing is, and again, it's the old references again, and that's a lack of expectation. I think we should have higher expectations of all our students. And I know it sounds a bit of a cliche, and I said this only last week. I said, all of you can get first if you want to. It is about you tell me what it is you need in terms of access to material or a lack of understanding. I will repeat myself as much as I need to, and so on and so forth. So I always think that this lack of expectation is one issue. It's an old adage of our kind of theory understanding of failures and so on. But I think we need to step back and look within ourselves, within our institution, within our curriculum, within our teaching methods, and so on, to then actually then say, well, let's see what we can do to raise the awards of our students, to raise their expectation of our students.
I'd just like to pick up a couple of things that you've said in terms about kind of our expectations of our students and what we actually do. And I would say that we, having taught, white and Black students, that I've come across white students who equally lack confidence in terms of their own attainment ability, in the same way that Black students have that similar kind of experience. And what I have sought to do is to really support those students, nurture them, and to kind of keep reminding them how capable that they actually are. To the extent that when you do have a Black student who produces really good assignments, for example, I've heard, especially when you're doing teamed assessment, colleagues saying, is that really that student's work? Because they don't correlate the student at mark with that particular student, who on paper and in terms of engagement in their lessons may seem to be not engaging, shy, not one of your expected higher achievers. And I have to say that, how much time do you spend with the student? And I've actually found that the more you break things down for students and support them, and reassure them that they can do well, they will achieve. A case in point is white middle-class male student a couple of years ago doing a master's degree, and he constantly kept saying to me, oh, I can't do this, you know, despite having a good degree classification. And even at graduation, once he got his MA, he was, I never thought I'd do this, I never thought I would do this. You know, and for this one white student, I've got lots of examples of this particular student, but I equally have similar kind of examples from Black students. But I think what we tend not to do is then to share our experiences about these different student groups where they have similarities and focus much more on the kind of differential outcomes. And because you have more students, Black students who don't achieve as well as white students, it then, you know, becomes really problematic. I can see that Ursula has got her hand up.
No, I just want to jump in on that, because I think we need to go beyond the black and white scenario, because you will have mixed race couples who have children. I thought, for me, it's a question of class, because we're not comparing apples for apples. When we're talking about white middle class students, we're talking about potentially well-off students who've come from a privileged background in terms of they've had a good base education, so they haven't come from, say, an access to education course. You know, whereas other minority groups may have, like myself, came to education as a mature student and went through the access to education route. And what I would say is, as an Irish person, I would consider myself to fall into that BAM group, because I've been constantly like stereotypes, you're stupid, you're this, that and the other, and loads of stereotypes. You know, hence why the Irish get on so well with the Jamaicans, because when we came to this country first, we had terrible abuse and terrible, you know, marginalisation, and you couldn't get jobs, you couldn't get into universities. So I think the debate is more complex than just getting into the realm of comparing black and white. I think it is about class. And what concerns me is, in the Equal Opportunities Act, out of the 9 attributes, class isn't even mentioned, whereas race is and disability is, etc. And then I was also going to add in, as a severely disabled student, I'm completely blind in one eye, nearly blind in the other. And I also have severe mobility issues. So for me, I want to go on and do a dissertation, but I'm being told point blank, well, the Russell Group have one means of assessment, and that's, you know, 100,000 word thesis. And I'm trying to be the trailblazer to break down the wall and saying, well, actually, not every student, no matter what their background is, particularly minority groups and students with disabilities, Black students with disabilities, Asian students with disabilities, etc. There should be more than one mode of assessment, because from my experience, doing my degree, there was reasonable assessments. You do your master's, there's reasonable assessments and accommodations, but then you get to that PhD level and it's all blockers, and you're told that, oh, well, I'm sorry, the Russell Group won't entertain anyone that wants to do a different mode of assessment. So I think that's part of the problem, that we live in a very contemporary social mediated world, and a lot of young students from all backgrounds have fabulous talents and skills and artistic creativity, that we should make more of a multitude of means of assessment rather than just boring essays. And I don't say that in a boring way, but, you know, these dissertations that get lodged for PhDs don't even get read. And yet you've got all of these majorly talented people, because I think a big example would be somewhere like Goldsmiths, where a lot of minority groups went without A-levels and really succeeded in the arts and humanities, because there was more flexibility around, right, we celebrate music as an academic subject, creative writing as an academic subject, you know, acting, all different sort of things, that it's not just strictly academic and it's strictly writing.
Yeah, there's some very, very, thank you, Ursula, for your comment. Very, very interesting point. There's 2 things I'd like to pick up, if that's all right, Uvanney. Just one is, you're absolutely right. Class is absolutely central to an understanding of education inequality, and that goes without really any argument. But so when we talk about BAME groups, we have to be, and I think Uvanney would agree with this, we have to look not just at national background, ethnicity and religion, so on, but also class. And we know statistically, when we look at BAME students doing, if we're talking about now attainment levels and so on, you have got groups, I'll just say crudely now without any statistics, but Indians and Africans doing better than Jamaicans, Caribbeans and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. And that's completely to do with class background and you know, socioeconomic positionings and schools, parental, educated background and so on. So class is always, I think, on par together, has to be taken together as part of the intersectional kind of arguments for educational attainment and so on. So I absolutely agree with you. I don't think we can ever forget class when we're trying to understand educational achievement. But I also think in addition, so this is an addition, it's not either or. In addition to that, I do think that ethnic minority students experience in education, and I can talk more confidently about higher education, that they do need to also feel valued, feel a sense of belonging, feel engaged in their educational experience and in their classes and their studies. Because research is showing that when they are not engaged and they don't feel that they're bored or they can't relate to their subjects, then they're doing less well. So I think those two things go together: class background, the confidence of class background that brings, you know, whether it's the way one, you know, the confident way that one writes when they come from the middle class backgrounds and all that stuff around assessment's absolutely true too. But also cultural affinity, I think, which is, I think, something that Uvanney talks about in your paper, about the importance of multiculturalism, the importance of citizenship, the importance, and I talk about that in my paper in the decolonization debate, that we need to decolonize Eurocentric education to ensure that minorities, and that, you know, can include, because I think a lot of Irish experience is omitted from our education. So I'm talking generally, you know, that the dominant cultural groups are still dominant in education, in my experience, and therefore we need to decolonize. That goes right across, and therefore include minority experiences, because that's what our society is. I mean, I'm saying, I talk from the perspective of Wolverhampton. When I started my teaching in 1990, quite a long time now, there was 30% minorities, BAME minorities and minorities. Now we've got 60%. But that and I talk about this in my paper, so we've got a threefold growth in the entrance, yet the staff representation doesn't match that. Okay, so I think that for me is a social justice issue on many levels. I also think is that we need to see more minorities in positions, educational positions of power and teaching positions, so on, because I think we owe that to our students, because I think there is, you know, the whole decolonization process and debate is more than just changing your content for your teaching. It's about assessment. And I think Paul Campbell, who, where's he from, Leicester, talks a lot about how, and you made a really good point then, Ursula, how some people and some communities might be more engaged in particular forms of assessment and therefore do better. And he talks about that issue. So I think intersectionality, taken on board, there's differences that are not just ethnic differences, but also class differences and all the other differences, needs to be considered when we want a better, good education for our pupils and students. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I mean, I agree with you, Ursula, that there does need to be greater recognition of students' diverse ways of learning. And Goldsmith is a really good example of where that's worked really well in terms of the, you know, doctoral dissertation. And whilst I agree with that, I do think though that, and I don't disagree that class is important, but I am aware that particularly Black children, Black students from middle class professional backgrounds, that they equally do not do as well as Black working class students. And that I go back to about the kind of stereotypes there are about particularly Black Caribbean students, that they're coming from families that are disinterested in education, that they don't value education, therefore they're not supporting, So in my paper, I talk about kind of supplementary schools that the government was interested in, and the kind of impact of supplementary schools on Black students' outcomes. David Gilbourne, Carol Vincent, Nicola Rollock, they looked at the Black middle class students in schools, and they were equally not doing as well as your Black Caribbean working class students, because those kind of stereotypes that teachers do have, that these Caribbean students are not going to do well, therefore they're not expecting them to be high achievers. And within the supplementary school research I did, it was quite evident that you would have students being told in school, particularly at coming to do maths GCSE, for example, that they're not going to do well, but yet they studied their maths GCSEs at their supplementary school, which is kind of an after school group, and on a Saturday, and coming out with A's and A stars, totally contrary to their mainstream school expectations. And that in those schools, they're being taught by Black educators, Black parents who really are, invested in their interests. And Yosso also talks about, Tori Yosso, who's an American, talks about the kind of the community cultural wealth, the kind of cultural capital that Black students bring to the learning experience, which white teachers do not recognize, because it's not when they think about cultural capital, they're thinking about Bourdieu's ideas around cultural capital, which is associated very much with your white middle classes. And obviously Black communities, if they are predominantly working class, they're coming with different kinds of community cultural wealth, but it doesn't mean that they're not educable, which is what kind of Einstein would say in relation to Black communities. So I do think it's more complex.
Absolutely. But I'll respond to that very briefly. I suppose what I'm worried about is the kind of divide, because when I did my access course, I had the reverse. I had a Black tutor who was excellent, but was very prejudiced towards me because she had made an assumption that I was middle class, well off, which is absolutely the opposite. I came from a very working class background with not a lot of money, literally came to London one way with not a penny in my pocket. And it was only when she got to know me, she apologized many months later saying, I made complete assumptions about you that were untrue. And I said to her, you should have given me a chance, because I, from day one, thought your teaching was excellent. And I came away with a distinction. Before that, I didn't have an exam to my name. And I got 22 distinctions in an access course because I had this fantastic head teacher, but the first few months were really rough because she just had a total prejudice towards me. And it felt as if because I wasn't Black, but then when she got to know me, she knew I really was Black, if you understand the analogy of, that I understood the struggle and I had similar experiences myself. And this is what I'm saying about, if we just judge people by the outside, we're not going to get to the inner problems of the complexities and nuances, as you say, of class, disability, background, everybody's experience is different. And we mustn't make assumptions and just put people into a category, white middle class, because it's not going to integrate a future where we're all thinking about social justice and we're all thinking about understanding each other. And, I'll conclude by saying, even somebody, dare I say it, like Lady Di, many, many years ago, who came from a very, very privileged background, but she could walk into, a centre with homeless or the AIDS, or go to Africa with Black children and go and meet Mother Teresa. For me, it's about humanity and, the mines and all the things she did, even though she came from a really privileged background, wasn't particularly into education, but she had a natural ability to walk into a room and show humanity and care and connection. And I think that's, from my experience in this country, what's missing. Otherwise we're becoming very binary, which I think we need to think beyond that. And anyway, I'll leave it there.
And let me just respond if that's okay. First of all, I'm sorry you had that negative experience on your Access course, Ursula. I started my career being an Access teacher for and I went in there with that energy of giving what I saw students, and there were Black and white and of all different religious backgrounds and Asians and so on. And I'd like to think that I was one of those good teachers that actually my aim was to give them that second chance of education, because all the students that turned out were, I mean, this is Wolverhampton, so it's inner city and so on. So predominantly working class background anyway, but all the students were lacking in confidence. They had really poor experiences. Some of them were race related, but not all of them. Some of them were lots of poverty related, gender related and so on, and other inequalities. But they came on an Access course post 21 years, so they were at 23, 24, up to 40 something. And I remember thinking, this is my opportunity to turn it around for them, to give them a positive experience of education so they can go on to university. And most of our students did go on. We managed to hold on to our students. But let me just tell you one story which I write about, one of my first publications, which still makes me quite tearful. And this was a young, well, I say young in her 20s now, young to me now, but she was probably mid-20s, Rastafarian woman who had already had 4 kids, and she came to my Access course. So it's a sociology module, and she'd never had very little education, but decided to go back to education, if you like, and did the first, which is I suppose equivalent to the GCSE, and then she was doing the second year of Access, which gives you entrance to university. She did really well in the first year, and second year I saw less and less of her. By Christmas, and I'm sure I've broken all the protocols in today's kind of health and safety, I was so upset that she hadn't turned up. I got her address and I knocked on her door, and when she opened the door she was embarrassed and quite upset. And what had happened is that she had a few little kids and her partner just left her, so she couldn't carry on. And I remember saying, let's just call her Yvonne for now. I said, I'm not going to let you go. He goes, but Shirin, I can't. I've got this babe crying baby. I said, you're going to come to class. We're going to find a crash for you. We're going to, and she did come back, and she did complete. And I remember saying, I'll hold your baby if I have to for you to sit your papers and do your exams. She did sit her papers, and she left, and she completed, and she went on to university. 5 years later, she sent me a Christmas card saying, without you, I would not be where I am, because I'm now a school teacher. And it's just, so there's many stories like that. And it's about how we step in and step up to the game and ensure. And I'd like to say that good education is those that do not get blinkered by cultural prejudices. And I'm sad to hear you had that. And I'm glad that this person had turned around and misunderstood you. But in my experience, a lot of Access courses are actually catching like a net those that are missed out first time round. And for those students that are turning up to Access courses, that's probably because they've had a lot of stuff in their life that's prevented them continuing education. And I'm grateful that Access is still available for students like yourself to give you that second opportunity. So yeah, and I'm glad it turned things around. And I'm sure that teacher had learned from her experiences with you too. And this is why for me, Freirean and critical race theory, but Freirean critical pedagogy, the kind of stuff of reaching out to the most marginalized, to the most out there that needs the support, and the kind of interaction with their teacher that builds on their support, that allows them to believe in themselves in order for them to continue in their education. Yeah.
Oh no, without doubt. I mean, I will say that about subliminal prejudice, that way back when I was staunch kind of lefty Labour, I would think that privileged people kind of had it all, and they had it easy, and I had such a struggle. But I would say that it was only when my sister. Sorry, are we still online?
I don't know what happened there.
I don't worry. I think it was just I think we were getting cross feed from another mic. I think it's been sorted. So please carry on, Ursula, and then Annie might want to.
Yeah, no, what I wanted to say, I mean, sorry for sharing my experience. I suppose I wanted to raise the tempo of the debate in terms of that it is about human understanding, because even my subliminal prejudice, it was never ever against religion or color. It was assuming that rich people or middle class people were, privileged, well off, lucky, and then you suddenly realize that they may have other issues like mental health issues, etc., but also they may be fabulously good people. I wouldn't be a Tory supporter, but that recent public servant who was stabbed to death did some great work in the community. And also I know some very senior academics who are very well off, and they take in refugees. And I suppose it's breaking down that. And I mean, I had to be pulled up on that. My sister pulled me up years ago saying, Ursula, you have a problem with posh people. And I had to kind of turn the light on myself and examine my own kind of belief system and assumptions. But I'll leave it there. I'll conclude.
I mean, Ursula, just on the kind of broader general point that you're making, and I would agree entirely that as educators, we need to get to know our students really well. And we also need to understand any particular biases that we may have. And I always say to my fellow colleagues, how well do you actually know your students? And you can only know your students by actually having conversations with them and finding out about their backgrounds and actually their learning journey, to the point where they're either facing you in a higher education classroom or whether they're in schools. And equally, I've come across white students who one would think that they don't have any diverse experiences, but they've been educated in different parts of the country, different countries in the world. And equally, you could have minority students who've never left a 2-mile radius of their locality. But you need to understand the backgrounds of the students. So I thank you for raising that point, and I agree with you entirely in that respect. Do want to go on looking at your paper, Shirin. You talk about enough is enough, and you mentioned about critical race theory and as being a pedagogy that we need to be engaging with. But I'd just like to kind of explore that a little bit, given that there's been quite a lot of backlash, in the States, particularly against critical race theory. So trying to understand from your perspective what critical race theory is and how does it contribute to social justice perspectives, but also more equality for student outcomes, given work with and your work in the field.
Okay, for me, I mean, critical race theory does a lot of things, but I think the main thing that it has provided for me a set of lens which centers BAME experience. Okay, and so you've got it helped me understand specific differences that maybe Muslim students might be experiencing, BAME students generally. So for me, critical race theory has said we start from the position, the perspective, and maybe this is why it's criticized, from the way in a cultural relevance of the BAME students themselves, and to look from that perspective to then go out. So for example, if I want to understand how to develop, which is what I talk about in this paper, to develop my curriculum, I will start with my students. I will start with a conversation with my students. And I think I make a comment there, and I've made it at conference papers and other papers where I said, our students are the best template we'll ever get. They walk into class, they come with the expectation of a sociology degree. I was one of those students. And I say that again, I make a reference to it where when I started sociology, I was thinking, why doesn't this sociology look at not just Black experience, but positive Black experience? Why do we always get a particular experience, which is negativity or problematizing Black kids that don't do well at school, problematizing immigration, because when they come here, they come and take our jobs, that kind of stuff. So I thought for me, it's really important that we develop our curriculum and by centering Black experience somewhere there. And we have those critical lens that then gives voice to those experiences. So in my sociology degree, for example, which I talk about, there's two things that I argue. Well, there's many things we can argue, but there's two things specifically that I argue about in this paper. One is to develop our curriculum, and the other is to look for greater representation in the university, because for me that is a social justice issue. And one of the points I make in the paper is that if we're not having enough students graduating, BAME students graduating with the qualifications that we expect them to, then actually what we're doing is an injustice, because it's untapped talent out there. And I talk of that not only the students that arrive to university, but I haven't taught access, having looked at my own community, I know that there are a lot of bright children out there. I'm thinking about, we talk about our children, how our children go on. My own children have had mates in this house that I think, my God, they're so bright. And then they don't go to school beyond 16, beyond 18. They don't carry on their education. I think, what a loss of untapped talent. Yeah. So I think what critical race has taught me is that we need to explore inequality. If we want to understand Black inequality, specifically BAME inequality, ethnic minority inequalities, we need to explore those inequalities by looking from inside, within, out, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe explore that a little bit, further, because in your paper also you talk about an understanding of white supremacy, which is a term that critical race theories use, and again, which is a reason why critical race theory tends to be criticized. So if you could actually talk to the kind of appropriateness of that, challenge, understanding white supremacy and kind of white privilege, which you also mentioned in your paper. As educators, why would we need to have that understanding in order to create educational difference?
Yeah, and what I mean by that, and I think what most of us mean by that, is whiteness or white supremacy or white privilege is presented as the norm. So if I look within my own subject, if I look within my own modules, the way in which theory, the way in which, say, sociology of education or sociology, I'm thinking of my modules now of gender issues, white privilege for me is normalizing the canons, normalizing those researches as if they're the only research in those subject matters. So what I want to do is not only presenting studies and research about Black and ethnic minority communities, but we bring on to the table for debate the people and the researchers like Fanon, like Du Bois. So we're not normalizing the canons that are of white European descent, but actually presenting that there are other canons that exist exist outside of England, but also within England, like the Stuart Halls. There's not enough celebration of our canons. So by not doing that, we're normalizing the kind of whiteness of our curriculum, which I think we need to unpack, and we need to replace them with a lot more Black experience. But also there are plenty of very credible writers out there that we need to bring onto our curriculum, and that's what I mean. And if we don't do that, it's going to make just white voices the normal voices of education.
Thank you. I mean, I want to kind of share an example from my paper where I talk about an understanding of diversity, and because I'm particularly interested in raising the achievement, particularly of Caribbean students, that I have given examples of where Black children have actually done well. So in terms of the example I've been using quite a lot recently is actually the £1 coin, and everyone's familiar with that. But the tail side of it, that actually it was a Black student, a 15-year-old who won a national competition of 6,000 entries to the Royal Mint to actually do some creativity as to what would be on the tail side of the £1 coin. Now, I've raised that £1 coin in lots of conferences before, and I've said, do you know who's responsible for the artwork on the back of this coin? And people do not know that this was done by a Black student. And we've got Shirin Mason, who and also we've got the person who played the cello at Meghan and Harry's wedding. But actually raising examples like that to say, again, thinking in relation to education, that whereas Black students are being pushed, they're really good at sport, they're only good at sport, but actually there are other talents that they have that can be excelled, nurtured by schools. So knowing that they are able to contribute in different ways, again, to take teachers away from those kind of stereotypes that there are around these different groups. And the reason I mention that is because you're talking about the kind of Black theorists that we ought to be drawing on as part of our teaching and learning process. But it also, in doing that, it requires the kind of knowledge about these different contributors to the educational process. And if the majority of the academic community, whether it's teachers or in higher education, are predominantly white, you suggest they need to do, again, thinking about the kind of ideas you have in your paper, what do they need, you know, what kind of knowledge do they need to do?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you've asked that.
To, you know, to use such theorists, the work of such theorists.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question, Uvanney, because it's a bit of a bee in my bonnet at the moment. I don't think, let me start again. I do think Black representation, and I mean Black in a wider sense, so ethnic minority representation is important for all the reasons we've talked about in terms of what that does for the student, right? But I also think good education, and you talk about, I think your words are for the public good. Yeah. I think good education is as important, and if it means our white colleagues are trained and are offering the books and the texts that our Black colleagues would, then that's good education. So one of the two things I talk about is Black representation, but also let's train our existing, you know, we have training for bias, don't we? We have training for health and safety. We have all sorts of trainings that I am having to do at university, and I'm sure folks here will have to do. And we have training for equal opportunities, but I'm talking specific training for staff to be aware of how to develop their curriculum, so their curriculum is much more representative of BAME experience. That means using the canons. I mean, in my job, I do that as an individual. So I say to my colleagues, oh, you know, we should read, you know, Du Bois, and you should look at Fanon. Fanon's really good on Black, white skins and racism. And, you know, I'm doing that, but that's not enough. I think it should be top down. I think training should take place so that all our staff in all departments are aware of how to make use of the knowledge outside. And, you know, one thing that's always bothered me all my life, and my kind of academic life, if you like, is that often, and I'm sure you've gone through this, and many some of the folks here, where they see Black skin or brown skin, whatever, and they think, oh, Shirin can teach that. And I always think, why should Shirin be able to teach that race in education or race? Oh, yeah, maybe I can, because it's, you know, it's close to my heart and I want to learn about it. But I wasn't born with the knowledge. I actually had to read those books. So my answer is, well, if I can teach it, so can you. Just go and read the books that I've had to read and you teach it. Because I actually think it's good having white lecturers teach Black issues, Black subject matter, referring to Black texts and canons is as important for our students, Black and white. And it's one of the things I've talked about. When a white student hears a white lecturer say, you know, the importance of bell hooks for education philosophy, the importance of Du Bois for the history of America, and so on, that is just as important, probably more powerful. So for me, there's a lot of issues in there. The main thing, if we go back to critical race theory, because we know Gilbourne's white, a lot of critical race theories are white, and it's really important that they also are part of the debate of how important it is to be anti-racist in your education practice, in your education teaching material, and so on. And that's the point really I want to make. And I think that's the point I'm making, one of the points I'm making in the article. So decolonizing curriculum is all of those things, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I mean, I'm quite conscious that sometimes I sound as if I push, you know, I'm always banging the race drum, and about staff becoming more knowledgeable about the same kind of things that I'm knowledgeable about. And I do agree with you that white staff, you know, it's quite powerful if they're equally as knowledgeable about these different contributors. In the same way that, I mean, interestingly, I was at, you know, with white colleagues a couple of days ago, and we were having an interesting conversation about the social and economic history of Britain, part of understanding why Britain is ethnically diverse in the way that it is. And what was fascinating from that conversation was that I was as well informed as my colleagues about the different groups that had come to the UK you know, as well as being knowledgeable at the, you know, the Viking invasions and the different kings and, you know, European kings and queens, all of this kind of knowledge, which helps to understand why Britain is as ethnically diverse as it is, and when different communities arrived and, you know, they left and went to other parts of the globe. That was a really interesting conversation which went on over dinner. There was this question at the extent to which our colleagues more broadly have that knowledge of the social and economic history of the UK, you know, which they could actually draw on to help them be more supportive of having an ethnically diverse curriculum that's taught, you know, which enables them to challenge, again, at school level, the kind of predominantly white national curriculum, but also HE, depending on their subject, they can also begin to think more broadly, how can I make my curriculum more, the students can appreciate what's being offered if they're coming from different ethnic groups, you know, so it's not just a standard white curriculum. But the kind of talking that through, there is constantly a backlash against, you know, having to develop more knowledge about different groups. You know, there is not time to do that. So again, from your own work, and you say it's important, you know, to teach against racism, how would you encourage staff to do those things which ultimately take time to do?
Okay, there's two things. I'm interested in you mentioned backlash. I think that's quite relevant. And I think the backlash, there's going to be some people that really don't want to teach that stuff. They're really uncomfortable. They fear the backlash from students even, you know, who is she trying to teach this stuff? There's all these real genuine issues. And what I've done, and actually it's been positively accepted by students, that when white staff, for example, my colleagues teaching in Dubois, the students are really enjoying those lectures. And so it started off with directing particular texts. I've done this recently on Black feminism, forwarding some digital kind of journal articles, and saying to them, you know, this is really interesting, have a look at this, you'll like this, and I know the students will enjoy reading this. You know, it's giving them that kind of generous support on a day-to-day kind of, and some staff are coming to me for some advice, but also when you go through curriculum development, which is what we're doing right now with revalidation. Our degree gets revalidated every 5 years. This is an opportunity at the moment, and also given the current currency of decolonizing the curriculum, I'm using that as a good starting point, and the Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth. I said, you know, this is our opportunity to have another go at really decolonizing our curriculum. It would be good for us as a subject, or for us as a university, but most of all, it would be really good for our students, all our students, not just minority students. So it's a kind of ongoing, this specific opportunity is revalidation, but ongoing every year. And I think it's really important when external examiners make comments. So I have had external examiners saying, you know, global education is really interesting. This is one of my module. It's really, the students seem to be really engaged in their topics on education in Pakistan, Malala case, education in Africa, South Africa. So they make really interesting and positive comments on that module. And then members of staff in my team will say, oh, how did you do it? What did you do? And then I'll just say, well, because I'm interested. I'm actually interested in global issues. So I bring it to class, and students, I've noticed, are very interested and very engaged. And these are white and minority students. They want, a lot of my white students will say, I want to learn more about education in Pakistan. I want to read Malala's book. I want to read. And so it's not just although I think we are doing it for our BAME students, our white students are really wanting to have a global perspective of the world. And when colleagues then hear from external examiners, from student evaluations, from my own comments, that all our students want more than just this blinkered funnel looking into our world, and they become more engaged and do very well, they want to do the same. So it's that, but that's not to say it doesn't go without tension. I'd be lying. So there's always tension. There's always this, oh, Shirin, I don't feel comfortable. Why don't you do it? No, and then we have to do it in a very collegial way, because no one gains anything if you get each other's backs up. So it's that kind of collegial, gentle direction, advice, using the student voice. I think student voice is one of the strongest we can use. If we can get our students to say, I'm really enjoying. I mean, I think I use it in this book, in this journal article rather, because it was the most recent student evaluation that came to me in June. So just before the publication, I added her quote, and she was saying, this module, I was very engaged because I liked the fact that Shirin referred to Black Lives Matter, etc., and the Islamophobia. It's so relevant, and she's a white student. You know, so it's that kind of constantly saying this is for the good education for all our students, to make them aware of the world that they live in, and to be critical about the kind of inequalities, the racism, the sexism. And so I would argue that a good education is one that is open-minded, that is anti-sexist, anti-racist, pro-disability issues, and so on and so forth, sexuality issues. That's what a good education should look like. So all our students, no matter what background they come from, feel engaged and feel valued for what they bring in the classroom. Yeah.
I would agree. In my chapter, I think I wrote about one of the greatest learning experiences I had when I was doing research in schools, was the comments by white British students telling me that they did not have a sense of belonging, a sense of, being welcome, when there are questions around minority ethnic students, being raised in class about the backgrounds that they come from. And they felt that when teachers asked those kind of questions, instead of feeling included, they actually felt quite excluded, which is kind of the opposite to the normal experiences of Black students, where they have felt excluded. But actually teachers turning that on its head and then saying, asking those students where their backgrounds, where they were from, etc. The most fascinating thing for me was to hear those white students say, actually, because if a student, for example, has a Caribbean or African heritage, for example, or an Indian heritage, they describe those students as having an exotic background. And they felt that they didn't have anything like that to share. But interestingly, in that particular study, as I talk about in the chapter, there were students there who said, for example, I'm 1/16th Irish, or I'm an 8th Welsh, and these parts of their UK identity were just as important to them as their wider English identity. But they felt that teachers never spent time asking them actually to talk about their ethnic, in inverted commas, identity, which they would have been happy to share. And so just thinking about the comments, you're saying that, your white students value this. Well, I know from research I've done, so when I'm talking about a kind of a diverse curriculum, I'm not just saying that this is because you have got minority ethnic students in your class, but a diverse curriculum should apply equally if the classroom is predominantly white.
Absolutely. And sometimes I'd argue more so, because they're not being exposed to difference. So we have a greater duty to teach about difference and cross-community experiences. Yeah, absolutely. Just on that point then, Uvanney, I mean, I've kind of underlined quite some really interesting issues in your chapter, is cultural relevant curriculum. I think that's a really interesting reference that you make, and I've come across it. And what do you mean by that? Can you share some of your views on that?
So what I mean by culturally relevant is actually, and it goes back to that question about knowing your students, understanding the backgrounds that they come from. So, I'm Caribbean, Jamaican, and I would want to share aspects of my culture, which help to inform my learning experience.
Yeah.
And I think that, because Gay talks about this, the culturally relevant. And so if you know the backgrounds that students come from, you can actually draw on their cultures, or you can encourage them to share from your cultural background the things that help to inform your kind of learning. And I find that we have far more similarities across cultures, then we do have differences when it comes to teaching, and learning. But being able to, that encourages students to think that they have something to share, and, you know, linking with your point around engagements. If someone is interested in, you know, Shirin's background, then you're going to engage with that curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you've just said, and it's so true. And I think in my words, I've said this already in this presentation, that our best template are the students themselves, is to actually unpack where they're from, what they bring to the classroom, what commentary, what views. And I used to, in my early days, when I first started teaching the race and racism module, I used to say to my students, you know, in this space here, it's a safe space, and you're not to actually speak negatively about other communities. And, you know, I was trying to actually say, you know, there's no racism in this space, it's a safe space. I'd say in the last 10 years, although we don't have outward racism, I wouldn't tolerate that, but that kind of ignorance, let's just use the word ignorance for a moment without being too insulting. I actually want those views to come to my classroom now. And I'll say that, I said, you know, if you're really uncomfortable about any particular views, you know, you want to ask a question about, say, you know, Islam and terrorism, but you're thinking it's not PC, it's not right, we need to bring those views out in the classroom. And I've written this, not in this paper, but elsewhere, because actually, my job as a facilitator teacher is to unpack those views, to direct them somewhere else, and for you to question them critically. And that's what I've been starting to do. And one of the things I've done in one of my classrooms, and I've written about this, is I've got students to write a question that they feel uncomfortable about speaking it out and not being identified with that question, and write it and fold up the piece of paper, leave it at the front of the desk while we have a break, so I don't know who's left what paper, in different color pens. And then I'll open those papers and I said, one student has asked this, and I'll read it out and we debate it. And that's been a really good way, because I kind of want to argue that education should be the place where we air our views, and if they're not very favorable views and not very positive views, we need to open them out for critique and discussion. Because if we don't, then what are we doing through our education delivery? Are students coming in, let's just say crudely, racist ideas, getting their A's and their B's and the pass and the 2-1s, leaving university with the same racist ideas? I like to think that when they come through us, that they have changed views at the end of their degree, that if they have any uncomfortable or critical views or unpleasant views or questions, that we need to be addressing them and hopefully changing their thinking on that view, whether it's against women, blacks, disability, and so on. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's where I think I have changed in the last, say, 50% of my education experience. In the last 15 years, I'd say that I really now want to use my teaching moments as change thinking moments to a much more progressive, critical way of being. And I guess that's why critical race theory came to me as a lens, because I think that's what it does. It really uses that critical pedagogic rethinking of education in the classroom for change thinking purposes.
Okay, and that's really interesting. So how effective have you found that? You know, how responsive are students to that way of working?
Good question, because as you know, as a teacher, the ones that speak to you are the ones you know have been touched by it and changed. So I have had tears in my office. I've had, you know, critical comments on emails saying, "Oh my God, I didn't," you know, and sharing. But the silent ones you'll never know. But if they come back, I think that's always a good. I mean, I always obviously go on a one-to-one. Say, how was that? What did you think? Give me some evaluation. You don't have to talk to her, or write an evaluation anonymously. So far, I would like to say my impression is that it's been received very positively. That students have said, "I never thought that these are the issues. This is my change thinking. Never thought that these is the way of a much more progressive." You know, they've started questioning their negative or their more prejudicious ideas about people. So I'd like to think that it has done some good, and it is for the good of education that much more critical thinkers have been produced. And maybe sociology is one of those subjects, I don't know, but I've been more positive about it, and I think I've achieved that in my experience of teaching.
So in your paper, is that what you mean to say, that we have no choice but to teach against racism?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And that's my shift from when I thought, be quiet, I don't want to hear any of your unflavorful ideas, and I know keep them outside the room, was one of a lot of our positions really, to now, no, bring it in, bring it on, because I want to unpack it and question it and get you to think differently. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, that's really fascinating. There's a quote in your paper which I'd like to read, because I was struck by the fact that you have written about it, but I, kind of get your reaction to this, if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
Because I wanted to know if your stance is informed by it. So in the paper, a student wrote to you and they said, I cannot breathe.
Yeah.
This with his last breath, another brother we have to lay to rest. Words cannot express the rage deep within, but yet society's saying, just take it on the chin. No, I will not sit in silence and say nothing. I will continue to petition. That's one thing for sure. Till a peaceful existence is what we can receive, and an end to tyranny and racism is what we must achieve. And I know that this was written in response to Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd. Yeah. And also in your paper, you have Donald Trump, you use his responses to Black Lives Matter protesters and also the storming of the Capitol Hill, and he gives very different responses.
Yeah.
To both events, and is your teaching informed by comments such as the that your students
always. Yeah. I mean, always. And one of the comments I make here, the missed opportunity this year, or last year, I should say, a year and a half, is that I would have gone into class the next morning in rage about all this, and then we'll have a debate and discussion. Because I didn't do that, I still kept in contact with students via email. Obviously, we're doing online teaching. And when this one student, she actually gave, like a lot of young folks now do voice notes. Yeah. So she said, Shirin, I'm so upset about everything that's happened. And I taught her that later. She would have been a final year student then. And she goes, so I've shared this. I want to share this poem that I'd written. I was completely moved and so on. And I said, can you get it? Can you just transcribe it? Because I don't want to get it wrong. And she did. And she sent it to me. I said, it's brilliant. I want to, this is a production of one of our students. I want the world to know about this. I want to know that these young people out there are angry, are using their intellect, rethinking the world critically and telling the world what they think. And she said, no, only my family have heard this poem. And my partner. I said, well, are you okay? Because yeah, absolutely, 100%. She was flattered that I put it in this publication. And I said, well, this is the least I can do, is to pass on my students' experiences and their voice, so the world can at least get to hear some of their views of how they feel in the current world that they're living in. I mean, she's a young woman of about 25, Yeah. She's also the student that after attending my second level race module and discovered the works of Angela Davis, came running into my class one day. She said, I've got tickets to see Angela Davis next weekend. I thought, how did you manage that? They usually get sold out within 2 hours. And, I just seeing that change in some of our students from not knowing people like Angela Davis, not really getting to understand about racism or generally, but racist attacks and murders, to now articulating it in a really kind of sharp, critical way is an achievement, Yeah, so I'm really pleased that that's happened to our students.
So do you think teaching in an anti-racist way and decolonizing the curriculum, do you think it's sustainable?
Oh, Uvanney, I'd like to say yes. I feel for me, it's such a long time in coming. And I get a bit personal here, folks. I was going to retire this year because I'm tired and I've done this job 30 years. I joined the university in 1990. And then Black Lives Matter happened. Yet another murder. And I know since George Floyd, there's been a number of murders and all this. And then I see my students at university and working hard. And I thought, I can't leave now. I've got to try my best for the next 2-3 years. And we're going through a revalidation, decolonizing the curriculum. There's a momentum out there that I don't think that there has been in my 30 years. And I want to capture that moment and hope that I can make changes as people are becoming more positive about changes in the curriculum. I think Neil wants to ask a question.
Oh, thank you, Shirin and Uvanney. I just wondered, as well as sort of, there's been a lot of pushback around sort of multiculturalism, hasn't there? I mean, whereas perhaps 10, 15 years ago, there was, by and large, unless you're on, you know, sort of radical edges of politics, there was a certain amount of consensus, perhaps, although you might disagree with that even. I mean, it's now got to the stage where you've got people like Theresa May and even Angela Merkel sort of kind of articulating their sort of concerns or even opposition to multiculturalism. I mean, do you see, what are your thoughts on sort of what you're arguing and multiculturalism, and are they the same thing, or do you see sort of differences between them?
Uvanney, do you want to answer that? I can talk about curriculum a little bit.
Taking the kind of wider issues, because I've looked at, I mean, we had David Cameron, we had Theresa May, particularly in relation to the school curriculum, and thinking that not wanting to teach about multiculturalism because the focus, that would take away the focus from a national identity, a national curriculum, and British values. Now, my argument is, and you know, I appreciate that there's been this backlash, and I kind of talked about it a little bit when I mentioned it to Shirin in relation to CRT. There is a lot of pushback against critical race theory, multiculturalism, having a diverse curriculum. And just looking at the school curriculum, when New Labour were in power, they were very much invested in having every curriculum subject that could be taught in a diverse way, that drew on students' cultures, their cultural backgrounds, but also emphasised the way that Britain is a multi-ethnic, multiracial society and has been for quite some time. And there were resources, funding resources for schools to actually make their subject, you know, their subject curricula diverse. I was part of an organisation called Multiverse, where we created teaching resources. We did a lot of training of student teachers and teacher educators to equip them with knowledge which was more ethnically diverse, which could be used to inform the curriculum. And also Art and Antiracist Teacher Education Network was around at the time, actually talking about some of the issues that Shirin was raising about challenging racism within the curriculum. So there was a whole movement, and then we kind of come forward to David Cameron 2010, where you had the coalition government, and then Theresa May, where we had the 7/7 bombings. So everything was then pushed back to say that the problem is multiculturalism. But I don't think that the problem is multiculturalism. The problem is society in itself. We're not challenging racist perspectives, but also the point I was kind of making earlier, having a knowledge of the reason why Britain is as ethnically diverse as it is, and actually knowing how long-standing different minority groups have been in this country, is that, and also the fact that Britain is built on the backs of slaves, you know, where the economic resources have come from in terms of, so just thinking about the kind of social and economic history of Britain, there is a lack of understanding. And when you have a lack of knowledge about these particular issues, every minorities then get blamed for all the ills that there are in society. And that's a huge problem, both within the school curriculum and in the ways in which teachers are being trained. So that's the kind of work that I'm involved in. And I see that when I go into schools, for example, that there are questions around, you know, the fact that I'm a professor, or before I had a professorship when I had my PhD, that this is Dr. Maylor and she's come to see a head teacher, and they say, oh, what's the name of your child? And actually I've got an appointment with this head teacher, or I'm there with a white colleague and the attention is given to my white colleague and not myself. And I would argue that that has not changed. There's, you know, because there's lots of experiences I could share and I've written about in relation to that. But the problem isn't multiculturalism. I think the problem is, in short, Neil, although I kind of gone around the houses to answer your question, is to say that there is a lack of understanding and knowledge. We do not have the knowledge base as to why Britain is as ethnically diverse as it is. And then you will have some communities who feel that they do not have a sense of belonging as part of that multiracial society. And we've got parts of Britain which are very white, you know, compared with some which are very ethnically diverse. It's the way in which society is then positioned and how different groups are pitted against each other, which I find problematic. So I think I would argue that we need to learn more about each other, the ways in which we are similar rather than to how we are different.
Okay, I was just going to add to that just quickly. Whilst there might be a state kind of anti-multiculturalism, if you like, if I just use that word for now, I actually think there's a momentum at the moment with the whole decolonization that the students at UCL started, and in South Africa itself with Roads Must Fall. And I think rightly so, and I'm glad that it's given me the courage more than ever before, because I can point fingers within my own university saying, look, this decolonization program has to be taken seriously. So on one level, at state level, there might be less interest in multiculturalism, but yeah, I can talk for university spaces. I'm hearing much more about anti-racist education, decolonizing education, more, you know, my professor's white, you know, all those kind of campaigns is actually beginning to get ears, you know, tweaking up for those changes. So I certainly feel, and that's one of the reasons I think I'm hanging on there for a couple of years, is I want to see those changes, and I'm wanted to be there and help some of those changes happen. And I think with our current revalidation talks within our kind of departments, I think some of those changes are happening. We've got, for the first time, a decolonization committee. We've got a student experience committee, which looks at BAME students as well as non-BAME students, all bringing that to the table for debate on making our university much more decolonized. So I'm feeling a little bit positive, more than I have for a long, long time.
But just to come back before, because I can see there's another question in the chat, but to come back though, Shirin, has that happened before the killing of George Floyd, that your university was moving in that direction, or has it happened just very recently?
I think it's happened more recently, although the talks around decolonization from 2015 with the UCL, the student campaigns, and some of the debates, especially in the history, you know, the history students on and in my classes. But I think it's probably been taken more seriously because of George Floyd and because of the current situation. Yeah, Black Lives Matter. Yeah.
And there's a question in the, well, someone in PESGB has got their hand up.
It's me, it's Ollie.
Yeah, hi, Ollie.
Hi. You both may have gone some way to answering this, but I just wanted to tease out a little bit more about this, about Uvanney's question as to whether or not anti-racist pedagogy, anti-racism, decolonization, if it's sustainable. And it's also related to what several people have mentioned, this sort of pushback. Do either of you think there is greater urgency, or that things might, this sort of approach might get harder because our current government has been so publicly critical of, has completely mischaracterized critical race theory, because it's come out swinging very publicly for critical race theory and for decolonizing? Do you see it getting harder to practice anti-racist pedagogy, or?
Okay, I'm going to answer this in one way, in a measurable way. Whilst the politics is going to be harder, and I might have to in my own place, and maybe others, fight on a bit harder for decolonizing our curriculum and decolonizing university. But I think one of the scare factors for the institution is that if we continue to have, in my case, 60% of our students being of BAME background, and we are not releasing them with a better degree awards, or we are failing them, or we're not retaining them, then I think that might be the impetus for us to sustain much better, a good education for our students, because we can't afford to lose them. We can't afford to fail them. We can't afford, retention issues and so on. So that might be the reason that we have to keep this fight going. I don't know. Maybe I'm being an optimist.
Well, I'm kind of a glass half full person. I do think that there has been a sense of greater urgency since the killing of George Floyd, that universities in general, have been rushing around to put statements, anti-racist statements on their websites, and to say that it's a much more inclusive space and Black students are welcome, and then they're going to have good outcomes. But I do worry with the political backlash that seems to be coming from, not just the Prime Minister, but other members of the cabinet who are also, from ethnically diverse members of the cabinet who were actually, Kevin Badenoch, Equalities Minister, pushing back against critical race theory. So that does worry me. But I think it is incumbent on us as educators who actually believe in, having a diverse curriculum and one that produces equitable outcomes for our students, to keep that fight going, and that I'm very much committed to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I think that all the students I've had, it doesn't matter whether they're Black, white, Asian, whatever background they've come from, I've always been 100% committed to them achieving the best degree that's absolutely possible. And students have got doctorates where on paper you would never have thought that they're going to achieve those doctorates. And I know that, like Shirin, there are other educators like us who actually believe wholeheartedly in students getting good, GCSEs, A-levels and good degree outcomes. So the fight continues, as they say, the struggle continues. And I've been, like Shirin, I've been in this game for a long time, and been challenging racist pedagogy, trying to get the curriculum more diverse, but actually just getting students from the different backgrounds more included in teaching and learning. And actually getting educators to have a better conception of the different backgrounds that students are bringing to that learning space. And I will continue to fight for that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, Ollie.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. I can see we're coming up to we're at 6:30. So I don't want to shut down your conversation, but I wonder if we could sort of just encourage more hands to go up at this point, more questions to be offered. How would you feel about that for a few minutes?
That's absolutely fine, Ollie.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, so if there is anyone who would like to raise a digital hand and jump in with a question, please do so. This takes me back to the terrors of teaching online when a 5-second silence feels like an age.
Well, whilst we've got this silence, just to say to folks listening in that I think the article, and I'm sure Uvanney will feel the same, if you're more than welcome to have access to, I think Ollie, you put up my...
Yes, I've shared it through it should be available through the chat function in this Zoom call. So, and thanks for permission to do that, Shirin.
Okay.
Yeah. We have another question from Ursula, another comment or question from Ursula.
Hi, Ollie. I'm not going to put on my camera because I'm too tired. But no, I just really fascinating discussion and really interesting. I just think, first and foremost, for me, multiculturalism, it's not a theory or something that goes in and out of fashion. It's a reality within culture and society. Despite the problematic of the media and the social prejudice against particular minority groups. So that said, concentrating on George Floyd's murder, I just think that most young students, in fact, I would dare to say the majority of young students in education would have been devastated by George Floyd's murder by and I emphasize, white American police officer. But what I would caution, and this is a big caution to say, is that most well-informed people know that America, unfortunately, is a horrific cultural case study. I mean, the American dream didn't work for most minority groups. And that we do not want to advocate. We can't, I think in Britain, obviously, we offer George Floyd's family and all the educationists in America all the support and advocate 100% that we learn from this, absolute outcry and this rally to action and push America and Trump and all the other social actors to look at its stark system of law and order. But we mustn't conflate it with Britain, because Britain is a very, very different story. And what I always admired about Stuart Hall, because all the Black writers that was mentioned tonight, I studied all of them at Goldsmiths. Angela Davis is one of my heroes, particularly her work on, the majority of Black people in prison in America, I stress again. But what I think was so unique and special with Stuart Hall was that he talks a lot about race and representation in a very eloquent way during the 70s, 80s, 90s and noughties. Obviously, he was a figure in media, because I didn't quite agree early when they said not a lot of people read Stuart Hall. He was mainstream in Goldsmiths and other universities, even in the PESGB now, and UCL and IOE, etc. But I would say that he didn't appear to talk, once again, about this white-black binaries. He talked more about, and this is where I think he was extremely progressive, and I worry sometimes we're going a bit backwards, that he highlighted more about colonialism, which is the issue, because it's kind of a hangover from the past, and feeling like, even though in his mature age, despite his massive popularity in cultural studies, sociology, philosophy, the arts, music, etc., that he still felt like a stranger in British culture. And I suppose what I'm trying to emphasize here is, for example, and I'm not a case in point here. For example, as an Irish person, I've lived here 34 years, but I'm still made to feel as the stranger in British culture. And I think that's the issue, because we can talk about all these debates and talk and be PC and say we're going to be inclusive, but the reality is somewhere else. But then you have to be objective that on the other side of the coin, we mentioned the coins earlier, that Stuart Hall is a scholar in the 50s, got off that boat, and he still managed to get to Oxford, the establishment, and achieve social justice, in his publications, in his rallies. So you can still do that. I mean, sometimes I worry that we're doing a lot of talk and not enough action. And because at that time in the 50s, despite British exclusion of the other, Stuart Hall and others, and the others were mainly actually white people, went out there and objected. And I don't want to continue too much. I think a big part of the problem, obviously sociology is part of it, but I think it is problematic historically. And I do think it is about raising awareness of different cultures' history. For example, and I use my experience again, that when I went to school, we learned about British history. Most British people know nothing about Irish history, even though British colonialism was in Ireland for more than 800 years. And, our properties were taken from us, our land. And the irony is that British people hate gypsies, Irish gypsies, and they created them by kicking them off their land. But that history isn't known. All people know is, we don't like gypsies, who were a severely marginalised groups without any rights, who don't get into university. And I just think that it's more about coming together to obviously object about things outside of our culture, like what's happening in America and everything else, but equally come together to all of us face, whether we're Irish, British, Jamaican, Muslim, etc., 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 and the list goes on, to face, listen, this is where we are as a young community. This happened. We need to face up to it, and many horrible things happened with the IRA towards British culture, and somehow come together in some form of a healing, understanding, contextualizing the history. Because I mean, I'm a big advocate of Black history being on the curriculum all year, not just for 1 month. But I would love if there was a month of Irish history, which there's never been. It's all been pushed under the carpet because there's been so many horrific stories that we were not allowed to sing, dance, go to school, practice our religion in bush schools, etc., etc. So I'm just saying, as a kind of a 21st century, young, hopefully dynamic educational community, it's about coming together and first and foremost understanding our local culture, and then understanding the more global stuff like, you know, the pandemic, global warming, you know, the worry of the domination of science and technology, and so on and so on. And I know that sounds a bit preachy, and I don't mean it. I suppose I'm trying to raise the awareness that not just of my social group, of many different social groups that don't even get a voice or a platform or a stage to express their history, their culture, and the you know, struggles they're living through. So that's what, sorry to be so expressive.
No, thank you for that contribution, Ursula. I mean, just before we came on, I was asked the question by Ollie, and was it Ollie? Was it Neil? I can't remember, one of the two, about what I thought of Black History Month. And I said two things. One is it's important because it's no other time. But two, it's sad that it's only for a month. So if we had more minority histories permeating all our curriculum, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. And when I say that, I mean all our histories should be permeated. And I think I made a reference to, I think it was the Caribbean when I went there one year, and they called it Heritage Year or Heritage Month. And I think just to acknowledge that we now live in a complete multicultural, multiracial society. And I think you've got some statistics. The second minorities are white minorities. I think Uvanney, one of your statistics. So we've got to recognize that we've got Eastern European, Polish. And now when you walk through the street, like I was raised in East London, and I always say to my kids, now I live in Birmingham, that I'm walking down the high street and I see white folks, and I'm just assuming they're English, and they turn around and they speak a language that I don't recognize. So we are living in a highly multiracial, and we've got minoritized whites as well as minoritized non-whites, and I think our education should acknowledge that. So 100%. But just on the other issue of Stuart Hall, I think we talked about class and education. Absolutely. Stuart Hall be first to admit that he was highly middle class from Jamaica. There's lots of issues around, he talks about skin color and so on. And that film, the Stuart Hall story, is a really interesting film where he reflects on his background. But, you know, this country, the sociology part, didn't celebrate and in the way that he should have. He had to leave Birmingham University to get his professorship at Open University. I'm right, aren't I, Uvanney? They didn't make him a professor at Birmingham, even though he's one of the most renowned, as I agree with you, yes, Ursula. He was actually my hero and why I got into social in the first place. So, but then the academia didn't recognize him. He had to leave Birmingham in order to get his professorship. So I think in one sense, yeah, even the middle class blacks might have a little bit of an opening. They don't get the recognition that they deserve. Yeah.
My apologies. I thought he was brought in by Richard Hogarth as a director.
It was one of the but it was not.
The centre closed down after 11 years.
Yeah, and he wasn't made a professor. He left before it closed down. I joined before they closed down in 1980s. The CCCS, progressive place, but you know, didn't recognize him enough to make him a professor, so he had to leave. Yeah,
and I think that I think you've made my point for me, Ursula, because I did say that, you know, educators need to have an understanding of the different backgrounds that students bring to that learning experience. And also when I was talking about Britain's social and economic history, that does include what happened, you know, to Irish communities. It's about having a broader understanding of European, you know, UK colonization, European broader colonization, as to why we have a Eurocentric curriculum, the parts that are valued and seem to have less value, the reasons why some communities are considered to be of lower intelligence, you know, and here I'm talking about Black communities, that they're only, you know, destined to be servers and to work in, you know, lower skilled employment. We need to have that understanding. And I was like, when I was making the comment to Shirin about the conversation I was having with external colleagues and our knowledge of British history, surprisingly, I know that I'm far more informed than many of my colleagues in terms of Britain's economic and social history, because I studied history. But it's beholden on all of us to want to acquire much more knowledge, not just about the country we live in, but of the different communities and when they arrived. So somewhere like Bedford, you know, where our university campus is for education, we've got long-standing Polish and Italian communities. I think the Open University, one of their courses, there was a book that talks about Bedford and how Bedford became an ethnically diverse community. And outside of London at the time when the book was published as part of the course, Bedford was the most ethnically diverse town outside of London, you know, and that ethnic diversity was predominantly Polish, Italian, and Indian when the Indians came to the brickworks. So it's about having an understanding about how towns have developed over time and cities and the different groups that have actually contributed to the development of different parts of the UK. So that's what I was talking about, having that knowledge base. And also I find that when I've got students from different backgrounds and different cultures, I ask questions of them. So I can in turn learn, because I'm not saying that I know everything about every student community, but I ask questions when issues arise, so that in turn I'm better informed to be able to support those students. And I would say that being involved in multiverse and other kinds of things, researching in schools particularly, has given me a wealth of ammunition that I can use in teaching and learning as a consequence.
Yeah, no, I totally get that, but I have to correct this, because I suppose it's a point about privilege again. Richard Hogarth, I've just checked it 5 times here, invited Stuart Hall to join the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in 1964 at the University of Birmingham, initially as a research fellow at Hogarth's own expense. In 1968, he was promoted to the director of the centre. I'm not trying to prove a point, I suppose.
No, he was a director. I know I've said he was never made a professor, so he had to go to Open University. He was the director of the course. That wasn't my point.
All right, then it goes on to talk about his success on television, talking about race issues. Yeah. But I suppose the only reason I'm saying that, as an Irish person, if that was one of our own, we'd be so proud and we'd be celebrating it. OMG. You know, you've progressed, you've got on TV, it's amazing, it's awesome, because we had so few representatives. And I suppose that's the point about representation, as you say, that he was one of the lucky ones that he went to Oxford. You know, he had all these fabulous opportunities, you know, at Birmingham, you know, where he went to after Birmingham, and then all the stuff he did at Goldsmiths, all the books he wrote, all the articles. I mean, he actually married a white woman who was a professor of history. So he was actually one of the lucky ones in the way of, as you say, he came from a middle-class background. And I suppose that's the complexity, that we mustn't look at the other side and say, because you're white, you're middle-class and you're privileged. Equally, there can be other stories on the other side where they are privileged, the person. I mean, I'm absolutely total, he's my hero, Stuart Hall, but in his own admission, he would say he was very lucky, but he was very confused about his identity, and he was a massive advocate, even for the Labour Party, for multiculturalism.
I'm sorry, Ashley, but I don't think that we are arguing against not, you know, profiling Stuart Hall. That's not the point. I think the point that Shirin was actually making is that she actually draws on his work in terms of the curriculum that she's actually delivering. So I think we're at odds in terms of...
No, I agree totally, but I suppose what I was trying to emphasise is that Stuart Hall is a success story. Whether he was black or white, he was a fantastic writer, a fantastic philosopher, sociologist, cultural
100%,
theorist.
100%
And
agreement.
yeah, and I look up this thing about he had to leave because I'm not seeing it anywhere on the internet, and maybe you're right, but I can't find it. So I suppose we have to celebrate, as you say, success.
I think my point is a really simple one, and I can talk about myself here. And a lot of my colleagues, BAME colleagues, and I'm sure there's a lot of Irish colleagues as well, but at the moment I'm just going to talk about the BAME colleagues, is that you reach so far and then your institution doesn't acknowledge. And so my point is, I completely agree, is one of the finest, and we don't want to get into this hierarchy of differences and privileges, or even celebrating individuals. But if we just make a race comment here, is that his caliber, and he hasn't written lots of books, he's written lots of articles, and he was part of the Communist Party and also New Left Review. So I've always been a great fan of his ideas. And so my sadness is that he should have been recognised. He was the director, and that's what I'm going to say about it. He should have been recognised as a professor. And I know people that have said that, who've had to leave this country and gone to America because the higher education institution, like Gilroy, is one, and indeed he came back because other issues were happening in America that he wasn't happy about. But a lot of Black colleagues have left here because they're just not acknowledged and recognised for their fine academic achievements, and that's the only point I was making. With reference to
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Uvanney, would you like to say anything more on that?
Well, not on that specifically, but just to emphasize that point that, in terms of Black professors, we are 0.6% of the professoriate, and it takes that much longer for a Black person to become a professor because all the things that I've kind of highlighted in terms of how our education is perceived and so forth, but also the greater challenges there are in being accepted as being an academic, and I've written about some of the experiences that I've had within HE. So, and I know that I'm not by myself. So there is a greater challenge coming back to your paper, Shirin, in terms of actually getting a more ethnically diverse HE workforce. I think that there is still a long journey ahead because where are those new HE academics coming from if our minority ethnic students are not getting your T1s and your firsts?
Absolutely.
If their experience in HE is not a positive one, where are our future academics going to come from?
Yeah.
Sorry, I know I've kind of hogged it, but I totally disagree. It is a big question about representation. And I totally agree that Black representation is virtually non-existent, particularly in the Russell Group, particularly in the philosophy department. OMG, there's no women, never mind Black people. So what I would say is there is a big issue about representation. One thing I'm fighting at the moment is the zero representation of disabled people on PhD programs. And that, I think, is the big question about representation. As you say, that, students come in and they see somebody that sounds and looks like them and has maybe had a similar background. And I just feel very passionately that it absolutely is about representation, even though people say, oh, positive representation is a negative thing. But I think you have to do that initially for it to become natural, that people are coming through the ranks, because you two ladies are the trailblazers. And I would imagine if in your department there's a staff board with all the pictures, you're in the minority. And that's, I think, what we need to radically change and challenge the, dare I say it, the Russell Groups and the centres of excellence, that there isn't just one way to skin a cat in terms of submitting some amazing work or making a difference in society, and I suppose that's why I joined the call tonight, because I read both of your pieces and I admired the work you did, and I greatly admire Angela Davis and many other scholars. But I think for Ollie, the big challenge in the PESGB is to take this back to the PESGB and really shake it upside down and say it needs to change. But first and foremost, change the so-called Institute of Education, which when I arrived from Goldsmiths, who had on all of the reading lists, many Black scholars, many female scholars, when I got to IOE, never mind Black scholars, there wasn't even female scholars, not one of them on any of my reading lists. And then I got to King's, where I am now, and it's the exact same. And this is the institutions we should be challenging. First and foremost, the PESGB, and secondly, IOE, which is supposed to be kind of a template for British Institute of Education, even though it falls under the banner of UCL. That's where you can really make the difference around changing reading lists, changing in the library that you've got Black scholars, female scholars, scholars with disabilities, etc. And, you know, I hope everybody on this call, whilst they might criticise me for hogging it a bit, you know, and I hope other people jump in, because we have to move away from this British politeness and actually wave some banners and, you know, rattle some cages and say, this is not good enough. The reading lists need to change. The library books need to change. What we're teaching needs to change. Representation needs to change. And anyway, I'll shut up.
I'm glad you said all that, because I think at least the three of us, your voice and me and Uvanney's voice so far, are agreeing, because 100%, as what we've been arguing and what I'll continue to argue, is a real big shake-up on every level of our education.
But the problem I have is I'm always a lone voice. Nobody
Ursula, I'm so sorry to cut you off, especially given what you're in the middle of saying, but we're very short of time. I need to give Uvanney a chance to respond.
See, this is what always happens. My voice gets shut down and then nobody else jumps in to give their contribution. This is what worries me, that it's still a minority argument. I'm very sorry, Ursula, you need to stop speaking. And this is what frustrates me, because actually we need to shout from the towers.
Yeah, and I apologise for that. And I'm despite appearances, I'm not trying to shut you up. I'm just trying to make sure that Uvanney is able to respond to your previous comment first.
I mean, I think you know, I mean, I agree that there needs to be greater, you know, when I'm talking about representation, I'm not just talking about that in relation to race. Obviously, Shirin and I, you know, we are minority ethnic women, so therefore we do speak to race, but I'm talking about representation across the protected characteristics. You see greater representation across the board. And in part, we were asked to talk about, you know, what we have written about, which primarily is about an ethnically diverse curriculum, also challenging issues around racism, which do speak to ethnicity in particular. But also we have talked about having all educators, you know, developing awareness and knowledge across the board about the different communities. So, and that would include students with disabilities, you know, which is a key issue for you, Ursula, and also talking about Irish communities. So when I say the student population is very diverse, you know, we have European students, we have students from the global south, we have UK students. So having a broader understanding around our student groups, but equally having a broader understanding of us, and I include myself within that, and with my colleagues, and more generally, the different backgrounds that we bring to teaching and learning. And once we have that, we can begin to make a difference to student outcomes. And until we have that shared knowledge and understanding, I don't think things are going to change. We will still have a hierarchy with white students getting their 2-1s and their firsts, and minority ethnic groups not doing as well, and actually doing worse than when they first entered higher education. And as someone who's interested in also school outcomes, equitable outcomes means for me that everybody, regardless of your starting point, should be able to do well within the educational system. And I think that's all I'd really like to say, Ollie. And I think everyone as an educator has a part to play in that process.
I think they're very important, good points to end this discussion. I think that's one thing we agree is our role as educators is to empower and to give the best possible opportunity for all our students. But we acknowledge that some students have been fared worse, and therefore we might just be thinking about decolonizing the curriculum and thinking about assessment regimes and thinking about other ways to ensure that they have that extra support to make sure that they do then achieve the best possible outcomes. Absolutely.
Thank you both. Ursula, we're very, very close to the hour, but did you want to respond one last time to those, to Uvanney and Shirin?
No, that's fine. That's really good. I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, albeit it got heated on my part, but that's my cultural deficit, that I'm passionate about social justice and change for everybody.
I think that's the one thing we definitely agree on, the social justice and change for the better for all of us. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Ursula.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution, Ursula.
In the last few minutes, no other hands have gone up. So given that we are so close to the hour, I think unless there are any really, really brief questions, I'm going to start wrapping things up and give my thanks.
Thank you.
Back on and give my thanks again both to Shirin and Uvanney. Thank you both so much, and it's been fascinating to hear you converse rather than present in the usual fashion, and you've been doing so for over 90 minutes now, so I can't thank you both enough for that either. Thank
you for the opportunity, Ollie.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the invitation, Ollie.
Thanks so much. Thank
you.
Bye
everyone for listening.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you, Ursula, for your input. We will communicate details about once this has been published and gone up on the YouTube platform or whatever platform it ends up on. We'll use the usual channels to let everyone know. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night. Thanks again to Uvanney and to
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.